6 figures. That is what a single photograph of Meghan Markle standing beside her 2 children on British soil commands on the open tabloid market. A veteran Fleet Street royal correspondent offered that estimate without blinking when asked directly, and he backed it with receipts. When Sarah Ferguson was photographed unexpectedly in the south of France back in 1992, that image set sold for a full £1 million. Hold that number in the front of your mind, because what actually happened in Northamptonshire during the second week of July 2025 makes that entire valuation framework collapse in on itself. And by the end of this breakdown, I am going to show you who was really holding that phone on the island, why the silence from Althorp estate tells you more than any statement ever could, and the one historical detail about Princess Diana herself that completely reframes everything the commentary class spent this entire week getting wrong. But first, you need to understand the water. Tucked away on the grounds of Althorp Estate in Northamptonshire sits a body of water that looks, from a distance, like nothing more than a modest, ornamental lake. Unremarkable. The kind of feature you might walk past on any English country estate without giving it a second thought. Except floating at its center is a small patch of land that no living person can reach on foot. No bridge crosses to it, no footpath connects it to the shore. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, had the crossing physically torn out years ago, and he explained his reasoning with zero ambiguity at the time. The water, he said, exists specifically to keep away what he called the deranged and the morbid. The marshy ground beneath the surface serves as a secondary obstacle for anyone stubborn enough to attempt wading across. This is not a decorative choice. This is a fortification built around the burial site of his sister Diana, Princess of Wales. 4 times over a span of roughly 20 years, individuals attempted to physically reach those remains. 4 separate documented incursions. Charles Spencer personally blocked every single one. That is the origin of this water barrier. That is why the crossing vanished. Not for aesthetics, not for landscaping, but because someone kept trying to get to a body. Now park that image in your mind. An island engineered to be unreachable, guarded by a man who has spent nearly 3 decades treating it as a personal obligation. Because what reportedly happened during the second week of July obliterates every assumption that arrangement was built on. Last Thursday, Meghan Markle uploaded 11 images to her Instagram account. Buried within that gallery was one photograph in particular that detonated across every platform within hours. A father walking with 2 young children along a tree-lined pathway. He is carrying flowers. His son carries some too. They are photographed from behind. No faces visible. The setting is unmistakably Althorp. I have turned this specific image over in my mind for nearly a full week, examined it from every angle I can find. And my conclusions run in a considerably different direction from the dominant conversation that consumed social media all week long. Here is what everybody else fixated on: taste. Whether the post crossed a line, whether it felt exploitative, whether it matched patterns, critics had long predicted from the Duchess of Sussex. That entire debate, every single thread of it, skips past something far more foundational that has been sitting right there in plain sight the whole time. Someone needed to physically transport a recording device, or at the bare minimum, a smartphone, across water that was specifically engineered to prevent exactly that kind of access. Someone needed authorization. Permission. A boat, a code, an invitation, whatever mechanism actually governs entry to that island. Which leaves one obvious unanswered question hanging over this entire affair, and it is the question I have not seen a single commentator properly chase down. Who granted entry? Here is the part most people are getting completely wrong, and it is the thread I want to pull hardest in this entire breakdown, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Before we even get to the flowers or the posting or the timing, sit with a specific sequence of events that unfolded during this same trip. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle flew into the United Kingdom. They traveled the length of the country. They met privately with King Charles at Highgrove House for what sources describe as barely an hour. They spent 2 nights on a secluded estate, and they departed again. Throughout all of it, British tabloids came up completely empty. No shots at arrival or departure. nothing captured roadside. No telephoto lens, finding a gap in the hedgerow, not even a blurry glimpse of the vehicle transporting them. The security operation around this entire visit held absolutely and completely. Publications that have spent a decade and a half hunting exactly this kind of material publicly conceded the operation had been executed flawlessly. Read that again. The tabloids admitted they got nothing. 0 frames. The most hunted couple in the British press moved through the entire country like ghosts, which quietly demolishes a story we have all absorbed for roughly 6 years running. The narrative the Duke and Duchess of Sussex themselves have advanced, repeatedly, across interviews, through a Netflix docuseries, and in Prince Harry's own memoir titled Spare, is that this family cannot set foot in Britain without being relentlessly tracked down, that their privacy is structurally impossible on British soil, that the press apparatus makes normal life unlivable for them and for their children, Archie and Lilibet. Yet here they were, undetected, unphotographed, genuinely private for the duration of an entire multi-day visit. Privacy was not merely theoretical for this family during this trip. It was actual, demonstrated, proven reality. They had it, they held it in their hands, and then Meghan Markle turned around and released it herself, free of charge, on Instagram. Sit with that contradiction because it is genuinely extraordinary. Nobody voluntarily surrenders an asset worth 6 figures purely out of sentiment. You release something like that deliberately when what it buys you exceeds whatever cash value it carries, which tells you the photographs themselves were never really the product. The message riding alongside them was, and whatever that underlying message actually communicated, it had precious little to do with laying flowers. Before I go any further, fairness demands space here, because I refuse to be the kind of commentator who pretends certainty where none exists. There is a genuinely plausible version of this entire sequence where none of it involved calculation whatsoever, where an uncle simply welcomed his late sister's grandchildren, children she never got the chance to meet, onto family grounds, where a father wanted a real, unguarded moment with his kids near his mother's resting place, where a mother shared a photo afterward without any of the strategic layering critics are about to assign it. That reading deserves genuine consideration alongside everything I am about to lay out. None of us were standing on that island, and confident certainty in either direction is something no outsider has actually earned here. So hold both possibilities simultaneously as we move forward, because the truth could sit anywhere between them. Now, the calendar. Because once you line up 2 specific dates side by side, the pattern becomes genuinely impossible to dismiss as coincidence. And this is where the story shifts from uncomfortable to something much harder to explain away. Wednesday, July 22nd, 2025. William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, released an official portrait marking their eldest son, Prince George's 13th birthday. The photograph was taken on a Kensington Palace staircase. Understated, warm, the kind of image that does exactly what a birthday photograph is supposed to do, and nothing more. Thursday, July 23rd. 11 images surfaced from the Duchess of Sussex's Instagram account, exactly 24 hours apart. That is the entire span separating the 2 posts. One day, one news cycle, one perfectly timed collision. I want to be precise here because plenty of online commentary has this wrong. Theories circulating on social media that connect the timing to some commercial product launch, tying it to Meghan's honey or jam or wine brand, do not hold up under basic scrutiny. That particular lavender honey product launched 3 full weeks prior and had already cycled completely out of news coverage. The calendar alignment is not pointing toward retail. It is pointing squarely at a birthday. At the Wales family's birthday, specifically. At the moment, the public's attention was trained most warmly on Prince William's eldest son. Think about that from William's perspective for a second. You release a carefully managed, deliberately modest photograph of your 13-year-old. Within 24 hours, the entire news cycle has pivoted to a set of photographs from your brother's wife, taken on the island where your mother is buried, featuring children whose faces you have never publicly shown before. Your birthday post is not merely competing for attention, it has been structurally displaced by it. And here is the part that should stop you cold. This is not the first time this exact pattern has emerged. Royal correspondents who track media timing professionally have documented a recurring tendency for Sussex media activity to land within hours of major Wales family milestones. It is a pattern with a paper trail. Not once, not twice, a pattern. Which brings us to the man standing silently on the far shore. Charles Spencer. And I need you to understand something most of this week's coverage has badly distorted. The commentary has quietly demoted him to a footnote inside his own family story. That is not just inaccurate. It is deeply unfair to a man whose entire relationship with that island is built on 30 years of personal guardianship. This is someone who personally oversees that burial site the way a sentry oversees a post. When Netflix approached him about filming scenes at Althorp for their dramatization of the royal family, he shut the request down publicly and made clear he found the very suggestion almost insulting to entertain. He blocked 4 physical incursions over 20 years. He tore out the bridge. He surrounded the resting place of his sister with water and marsh specifically to ensure that nobody could reach it without his explicit knowledge and consent. And yet, during the second week of July, he apparently welcomed Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Archie, and Lilibet onto the grounds for an extended stay. The circulating account from sources close to the family claims a specific condition was attached beforehand. Absolutely no cameras. Assuming that condition is accurate, what reportedly happened next takes extraordinary nerve, because here is the loophole, and it is one that observers flagged almost immediately. Banning cameras does not automatically ban phones. No film crew, no production van, no lighting rig. But apparently nobody explicitly prohibited a smartphone tucked into a pocket. The letter of the arrangement was honored. The spirit of it was gutted. Now, the landowner himself has offered zero public commentary since these images surfaced. Silent Thursday when the photographs appeared. Silent Friday as reaction detonated across every platform. Silent through the entire weekend, silent through the following week, still silent right now as I record this, nearly 7 full days later. Meanwhile, his personal social media feed contains nothing more recent than vintage family snapshots. Children on a swing set from 1966. A pony named Teddy Tar photographed in 1972. Nostalgia as a shield. The past deployed as a wall against the present. That silence is carrying an enormous amount of interpretive weight in both directions. Either he authorized the visit and is now quietly absorbing a backlash he never anticipated, or he never authorized what followed and has been sitting with a breach of trust so personal that he cannot bring himself to address it publicly. Pick a version. Either one lands hard. And I genuinely welcome him clarifying, because the longer that silence stretches, the louder it speaks. A single sentence would end this entire controversy by lunchtime. Something as simple as, "They visited as my guests, and I welcomed them gladly." That alone would drain every ounce of oxygen from this story. Instead, we get a 1966 swing photograph and nothing further. Let me add one more layer here that most coverage has underplayed. King Charles himself reportedly set very specific ground rules for the Highgrove House gathering, which sources describe as barely an hour in duration. The conditions were direct and unambiguous. No photographs, no publicity, no interviews. 3 rules. 3 clear boundaries drawn by the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom, a man who also happens to be the grandfather of those 2 children. If you are keeping count, that means 2 separate authority figures, the king and the earl, both reportedly established the same fundamental condition before this visit commenced. No images. And somehow, 11 of them ended up on Instagram within days. Here is what that tells you about power and about how the Sussexes operate within these family structures. You can set terms, you can draw lines, you can make your expectations unambiguous. And it apparently does not matter because the rules will be observed in their narrowest possible interpretation and then discarded the moment the phone comes out. That is not a failure of communication. That is a pattern of behavior, And it is a pattern that, once you see it documented this clearly, makes you understand precisely why certain doors in this family have been closing one by one over the past several years. Now, Prince Harry. Because the conversation this week has funneled responsibility almost exclusively toward Meghan Markle. And while I understand why, that framing lets him off a hook he does not deserve to escape. Meghan does not actually appear in that photograph. Look again if you are skeptical. She is simply not present in the frame. What is present is Harry, a boy around 7, a girl around 5. Armfuls of flowers. A pathway that his own uncle intentionally made nearly impossible to reach. Nobody understands the significance of that removed bridge better than Prince Harry. He documented it himself, in his own words, in his own memoir, Spare, published by Penguin Random House. Translated into over 40 languages worldwide, he explained plainly in that book that the crossing was eliminated specifically to shield his mother from intrusion. He described the water, he described the isolation. He wrote about what that island meant to the Spencer family and to him personally. He then published that exact explanation for the entire world to read. 40 language editions, millions of copies sold. He made the sacred nature of that ground part of his own public narrative, his own brand, his own carefully constructed story about who he is and what he has endured. And then he stood on that island with a device somewhere among the group and let the resulting images make global rounds by Thursday afternoon. Here is a considerably harder comparison, and it is one I have not seen anyone else draw this directly. July 1st, 2017, the date that would have marked Diana's 56th birthday. A modest, private rededication ceremony took place at that exact burial site. Prince William attended. Catherine, then Duchess of Cambridge, was present. Harry stood there too, alongside 2 of his nephews and niece from the Wales side of the family. The Archbishop of Canterbury personally officiated. Not a single image from that day ever reached the public. Not one. The ceremony was designed to remain fully private, and it did, without anyone needing the arrangement explained or justified or reinforced by threats of consequence. Everyone present simply understood the terms, respected them completely, and went home. 9 years later, Prince Harry retraced that same route under markedly different circumstances. Same ground, same purpose, different outcome. And the distance between those 2 visits tells you everything you need to know about what changed in the intervening years. Here is where my analysis breaks sharply from nearly everyone else covering this story, and I want you to hear me out fully before you react, because this part requires you to set aside the comfortable mythology for a few minutes. The prevailing sentiment all week has insisted that this location is sacred ground, untouchable, and that Diana herself would have been horrified by any of it. Plenty of otherwise thoughtful commentators have repeated that claim with total sincerity, and I keep returning to the same fundamental objection. Some of us actually watched how Diana operated in real time, not through the retrospective filter of documentaries and commemorative specials, but as it was actually unfolding. Diana sat for extended recorded sessions with the author Andrew Morton, working through intermediaries, and effectively handed her entire marital story to the public in book form. That book, Diana, Her True Story, became one of the best-selling nonfiction titles of the 1990s. She cooperated in its creation while publicly denying any involvement whatsoever. Controlled disclosure with plausible deniability built right into the architecture. Then came the Panorama interview in 1995, an hour-long broadcast from inside Kensington Palace delivered directly to camera that fundamentally destabilized the institution of the monarchy around her. 3 famous words. There were 3 of us in this marriage. One sentence that rewrote the entire public understanding of the royal family overnight. There were also the notably staged gymnasium photographs captured through arrangements that were considerably more choreographed than the public was led to believe at the time. Diana understood image management with an intuition that bordered on genius. Very few people who have ever carried a royal title grasped the mechanics of media manipulation as instinctively as she did. She deliberately, strategically, as a weapon against an institution that had systematically shut her out. And it worked spectacularly. It worked so well, in fact, that her story still dominates public conversation more than 28 years after her death. Which means this assumption that a photograph at her burial site would have automatically horrified her deserves serious examination before anyone treats it as established fact. She was the architect of controlled disclosure. She invented the playbook. The idea that she would have been uniformly appalled by its continued use, particularly by her own son's family, presumes a rigidity about privacy that her actual documented behavior does not support. I am not saying she would have approved. I am saying that anyone who declares with absolute certainty what Diana would have thought about this is projecting their own sensibility onto a woman whose actual relationship with cameras was far more complicated, far more strategic, and far more willing to bend conventions than the sanitized version of her story generally admits. Let me construct a framework here that I think clarifies what is actually happening, because without it, you are left reacting to individual incidents without seeing the underlying architecture. Think of public disclosure as existing on a spectrum. On one end, total privacy. No images, no statements, no public footprint. On the other end, total transparency. Everything shared, nothing withheld. Most public figures live somewhere in the middle, managing what gets out and what stays hidden, based on a combination of personal preference, institutional guidance, and strategic calculation. What Diana pioneered in the early 1990s was a specific technique I would call the controlled breach. You establish an expectation of privacy so firmly that any image that emerges carries automatic narrative weight. Then you selectively allow specific images to surface through channels that maintain your deniability. The public receives the photograph. The photograph tells a story. You never have to say a word because the image speaks entirely on your behalf. And if anyone questions the arrangement, you point to the expectation of privacy as proof of your good intentions. Morton's book worked this way. The panorama interview worked this way. The gym photographs worked this way. The mechanism is always identical. Establish the wall, open a carefully selected crack, let the light through, deny you touched the wall at all. Now watch what happened at Althorp through that exact lens. An island engineered to be unreachable, an explicit condition of no cameras, an entire security apparatus that successfully prevented any tabloid photography during the trip. Every element of the privacy wall firmly in place. And then, through one carefully chosen crack, 11 photographs emerge on Instagram, released not by a tabloid, but by the family itself, selected and cropped and captioned and sequenced for maximum narrative impact. That is not a privacy failure. That is the controlled breach executed at a level Diana herself would have recognized instantly. The wall was never the point. The crack was always the point. And if you are wondering why Prince William is reportedly seething over an image he has declined to publicly address at all, my read is not that this is about a lake or hedgerows or even flowers specifically. William came of age directly inside the aftermath of that exact media strategy. He watched firsthand, as a boy of 12 years old, what it cost his mother and what it cost his family when controlled disclosure spiraled into something none of them could contain. He then deliberately built his entire adult public life around doing precisely the opposite: measured, restrained, institutional. Often at genuine personal sacrifice, choosing silence when a well-placed interview could have won him sympathy, choosing restraint when retaliation would have been understandable. And now, by this reading, he is watching that same technique get revived and directed back in his direction, wielded by his own sister-in-law, using his own mother's burial site as the stage. Running what amounts to the same playbook Diana created out of genuine desperation in 1992, but repurposed here under entirely different circumstances by someone who, critics would argue, faces nothing remotely comparable to what Diana actually endured. Call it a disagreement over taste if you want. To plenty of observers paying close attention, it reads considerably more like someone borrowing your mother's exact voice specifically to talk over you with it. And that is a wound that no public statement, no matter how carefully worded, can adequately address. Before anyone treats the act of photographing a royal burial site as some kind of universally understood violation, let me introduce a detail that quietly dismantles that entire premise. September 2022. Buckingham Palace itself published an official photograph of the late Queen Elizabeth's memorial stone at the King George VI Memorial Chapel in Windsor. The royal household released that image directly, officially, deliberately. No controversy attached, no outcry, no accusations of desecration. So there is no sweeping, unbreakable taboo governing photographs at royal resting places as a general principle. What exists is one narrow, specific arrangement tied to one particular island, rooted in 4 documented break-in attempts targeting Diana's actual remains, enforced by one particular man for nearly 3 decades. This is not a religious prohibition. It is a security protocol born from real, documented threats. And the debate this week is not about whether graves can ever be photographed. It is about whether the specific terms governing this specific grave were honored or violated by the specific people who were granted access to it. On a related note, this exact burial site has already been at the center of a commercial controversy once before, and Meghan Markle had absolutely nothing to do with it that time. Charles Spencer himself opened the Althorp grounds to paying visitors on his sister's birthday back in 1998, charging roughly $16 per ticket. Elton John publicly condemned the arrangement as thoroughly distasteful. Then there was Diana's image eventually appearing on margarine packaging, an episode that generated significant public anger at the time, but has been almost entirely forgotten in the current wave of commentary. The history of this grave's relationship to commerce and public access is considerably more complicated than the clean, sacred, and untouchable narrative that has dominated this week's coverage. Here is the genuinely strangest thread in this whole affair, and it was surfaced by a royal correspondent who has been tracking Sussex media patterns with genuine rigor for over a year. The specific window captured in these photographs, the pool time, the family dog, a modest seaside dinner spot, wine, laughter, the golden light of a relaxed summer evening, represents the identical stretch of days that Sussex-aligned sources were simultaneously describing to the press as an unfolding crisis. During that very same period, reports circulated about statements being drafted and then quietly retracted, an ongoing standoff with British authorities over security arrangements. Claims the family had to split their travel plans because moving together was not considered safe. Prince Harry, according to sources close to the couple, nearly breaking down during a phone call. Meghan reportedly deeply upset throughout. 3 weeks later, that identical window of time has been completely repackaged, rebranded, presented as an idyllic summer holiday with the children, all sunlight and wildflowers and barefoot afternoons. One experienced correspondent described the contradiction with what I think is the single most incisive observation offered in this entire week of coverage. The photo series is not contradicting the earlier crisis narrative directly, this correspondent noted. It is simply behaving as though the facts were never a relevant consideration to begin with. And that observation lands with real force because it captures something genuinely unsettling about the broader Sussex communications strategy. You cannot fact-check someone who is not actually constructing a factual argument. You cannot point out contradictions to someone who treats consistency as optional. The photographs do not answer the crisis narrative. They simply overwrite it. And the overwriting itself is treated as sufficient because, for their audience, it apparently is. There is potentially one more layer here that deserves examination, and it may ultimately prove to be the most consequential dimension of this entire episode. Before these photographs ever surfaced publicly, reports were already circulating about a documentary project reportedly in development, timed to coincide with the 30th anniversary of Princess Diana's death in 2027. A royal biographer has claimed directly that these specific images may have been captured with that project already in mind, that the entire Althorp visit may have been structured, at least in part, around generating content for a production that would center Diana's story through the lens of her younger son and his family. If there is any substance to that claim, it reframes everything. The flowers become set dressing. The pathway becomes a location scout. The children become cast members in a narrative being assembled around them before they are old enough to consent to participation. And Spencer's ongoing silence may have nothing to do with anger at all. It may simply reflect genuine uncertainty about how to respond to a situation where his cooperation has potentially been converted into production assets without his knowledge or agreement. Consider the commercial arithmetic. A Netflix documentary marking the 30th anniversary of Diana's death, featuring never-before-seen footage of Prince Harry bringing his own children to their grandmother's grave for the very first time. The emotional payload of that content is almost immeasurable. Whatever sum the Sussex Netflix deal originally commanded, footage like that could restructure the entire arrangement. Prince William, by every indication, would be incandescent at the prospect of a documentary about his mother produced without his involvement or consent. It is his mother, too, a fact that the Sussex media operation has a persistent tendency to minimize. That is a genuinely uncomfortable possibility. And I want to be clear that it remains speculative at this stage, but the question itself is legitimate. Were those cameras rolling for a mother's personal memory? Or were they rolling for a production company's content library? Because the answer to that question changes the moral calculus of this entire story from one end to the other. One point deserves proper acknowledgement rather than simply getting buried beneath the analysis. Regardless of what transpired on that island, regardless of who authorized what or who posted anything, two small children were positioned at the center of an adult conflict. They had zero involvement in creating and no capacity to understand. Archie is around 7 years old. Lilibet is around 5. They were carrying flowers to a grandmother's grave. That act, stripped of every layer of strategic calculation and media manipulation and family politics that adults have since wrapped around it, is actually quite beautiful. A boy carrying flowers for a woman he will never meet. A girl walking a path her father once walked as a child himself. There is a version of this story where that is all it ever was. And the adults around those children, every single one of them, from the parents who brought them to the uncle who either did or did not authorize entry to the commentators, spending a week dissecting every pixel of a photograph taken from behind, owe it to those kids to at least hold that possibility with some care. That said, the decision to make that private moment public was an adult decision made by adults for adult reasons. The children did not choose to be photographed. They did not choose to have those images shared with millions of strangers. They did not choose to become symbols in an argument about media strategy, family betrayal, and the commodification of grief. That was done to them by the people responsible for protecting them, and no amount of face obscuring or backward angles changes the fundamental nature of that choice. And speaking of faces, here is a detail that the more perceptive observers flagged almost immediately. Not a single face appears in any of these photographs. The children are shown exclusively from behind. Side angles at most, a partial profile here and there, but never a full frontal image. The argument being advanced is that this approach somehow protects their privacy, that by withholding the faces, the parents are drawing a meaningful line between public and private. And on a surface level, that logic seems internally consistent. Except marketing professionals identify the technique instantly for what it actually is. What the Duchess of Sussex is executing, whether consciously or intuitively, is a strategy that the advertising industry calls a curiosity gap. By revealing portions of the children gradually, a side angle in one post, a partial profile in another, a silhouette in a third, she is creating a sustained appetite for the full reveal. Every partial glimpse increases the market value of the eventual full photograph. Every deliberate withholding builds demand that will, someday, be satisfied at a time and place and price of her choosing. That is not privacy, that is inventory management. The children's faces are not being protected, they are being warehoused. And the difference between those two things is the difference between parental instinct and brand strategy. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started and close every door I opened at the top. Who was holding the phone? We do not know with certainty. But Prince Harry was physically present on that island. He appeared in the photograph. He was carrying flowers on land he devoted an entire chapter of his memoir to describing as deliberately inaccessible. Whatever device captured those images, he was standing right there when the understanding with his uncle, whatever its precise terms, evidently fell apart. The camera did not walk itself across that water. Why is Charles Spencer silent? Two possibilities, and only two make logical sense. Either he authorized the visit and is now absorbing consequences he did not anticipate, unable to publicly defend an arrangement that produced an outcome he never sanctioned, or he never authorized what actually happened on that island, learned about it Thursday morning alongside the rest of us, and remains too bound by family loyalty or legal counsel or sheer disbelief to address it publicly. His silence is not neutral. Silence from a man who blocked 4 intrusion attempts and publicly rejected Netflix is an extraordinarily loud statement dressed as nothing. Why did this detonate the way it did? Because the photographs proved conclusively and on the public record that genuine privacy was entirely available to the Sussex family during this trip. The tabloids got nothing. The security held. Privacy was there for the taking. They had it. They chose to sacrifice it. And they sacrificed it not by accident or through a leak, but through a voluntary, deliberate, carefully curated release on a platform they fully control. That is the privacy paradox at the heart of this story. The people who have built an entire public identity around being denied privacy prove they can have it whenever they want it, and then demonstrate it in the same breath that they do not actually want it when its absence serves them better. And what about Diana? Would she have approved? Nobody alive can answer that honestly, but here is what the historical record actually supports, stripped of mythology. Diana was the original architect of the controlled breach. She pioneered the technique of establishing an expectation of privacy and then selectively violating it for strategic advantage. Whether she would have sanctioned this specific application of her method is unknowable, but the idea that she would have been uniformly and categorically appalled by it requires you to ignore roughly half of her documented media history. The truth, as always with Diana, is more complicated and more human than the cleaned-up version. The real question this whole episode forces is not about taste or protocol or even family loyalty. It is about something considerably larger. What happens when the tools of the powerless get picked up by people who are not, by any reasonable measure, powerless at all? Diana used photography as a weapon because the institution had left her with nothing else. She was cornered, silenced, discarded, and she fought back with the only resource available to her. There is genuine courage in that story and genuine tragedy. But the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are not cornered. They have a Netflix deal reportedly worth over $100 million. They have a global platform. They have the ability to command media attention at will, which this entire episode rather dramatically proves. When someone in that position deploys the same strategy Diana used out of desperation, the moral weight of it shifts entirely. What was survival becomes something closer to extraction. And the thing being extracted in this case is access to a resting place that one man has spent 3 decades trying to protect from exactly this kind of use. That is my honest read on all of it. Not the comfortable read, not the popular read in any particular camp, but the one I keep coming back to after a full week of sitting with it. And here's the part that is going to keep this story alive. Long after this week's outrage cycle burns itself out. The 30th anniversary of Diana's death falls in 2027. If there is genuinely a documentary in development, everything we just witnessed may have been the opening sequence. The flowers, the pathway, the children, the golden light. The first frames of a production that could generate a level of family conflict that makes everything to date look like a polite disagreement over seating arrangements at dinner. Which means the silence from Althorp is not an ending, it is an intermission. And whoever held that phone on the island knows exactly what comes next, even if the rest of us are only beginning to understand the question. Until next time, stay sharp and keep watching the water.